Hi, everyone, and congratulations to those who have made it to day 3 of the conference after what I'm sure was a long night in the drafting committee. So thanks for being with us. I'm not sure you'll thank me for being with you after the end of the speech, but let's see how we go. I want to be very clear. I do not represent the Red Cross Red Crescent movement. I am an independent journalist with my own independent views. But since trust is so intricately linked with transparency, I'm going to try to be very transparent. I want to start by talking about Syria because it exemplifies for me the challenge that I think the humanitarian sector faces when we talk about trust. I visited Syria in 2012, so right at the early days of the conflict. And at the time, the Syrian Arab Red Crescent had been thrust into this central coordination role that it wasn't accustomed to, nor, frankly, did it want. And within the Western-led multilateral system, there was a deep distrust, at least initially, of the Syrian Arab Red Crescent because it was seen to be an auxiliary of the government. Donors were wary to fund it. International aid agencies were wary to work with it. But, like all national societies, SARC is also made up of local volunteers from around the country, and in many cases, it was actually seen by the government to be supporting the rebels, sending them aid. And for that reason, many SARC volunteers were imprisoned and, in some cases, tortured. And so the SARC found itself kind of squeezed between these two sides, each accusing it of being biased towards the other. Now, over the years, the SARC actually proved to be much more neutral and objective than expected. And today it distributes 80% of the aid in Syria. And a sign of trust, I think, is that it is today able to do many cross-line operations. But the mistrust wasn't limited to the SARC. In some cases, well-founded mistrust existed at many levels, between civil society and the ICRC, between civil society and the UN, between UN agencies who were competing with one another to get close to the government in order to guarantee their access, between UN agencies and the government, and between the humanitarians on the ground and the political arm of the UN. Now, I'm not suggesting that trust is the only issue at play here. There's a whole other level of dynamics that everyone in this room is very familiar with, realpolitik at play, misinformation, propaganda, manipulation, instrumentalization, the list goes on. But at the humanitarian response level, certainly, this hugely polarizing situation, with mistrust on all sides, had very serious implications. Visas were refused, permits to move around the country were denied, attacks were made on aid convoys even after negotiations for safe access. So ultimately, we're talking about lives being lost. And a 2016 review of the humanitarian response in Syria found the following. The Syria case has highlighted the inherent and at times fatal flaws of the humanitarian system, which had largely failed in Syria. So when we say the word trust, it feels like a lovey-dovey, warm and fuzzy kind of thing, a nice to have, but not, the top priority when we're talking about operational realities of delivering life-saving aid. But my main message, as I think we've heard already, is that trust can make or break humanitarian response. And I'm afraid, as Antoine said with the NGOs, the humanitarian sector has a serious trust problem. And this is an existential issue that needs immediate attention. Because trust, or the lack thereof, has very real implications for humanitarian action, and particularly for national societies. Because they are quasi-governmental bodies, this challenge is even more heightened. So, as George mentioned, I run a news organization called the New Humanitarian. Some of you will know it formally as Iran News. And we're the world's only news organization dedicated to covering humanitarian needs and humanitarian response, conflicts, disasters, refugee flows, health emergencies. So we have a pretty unique, independent vantage point, and essentially, our journalists are documenting every day the result of trust existing or not existing in humanitarian response. And I'd like to share with you a few examples from our reporting that help illuminate what's really at stake when we talk about trust. The most obvious example today, Ebola. there we go. So this photo, taken by one of our journalists, is a soldier. You can see him between the car windshield at an Ebola cemetery in Beni in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. And our journalist in July met a man there named Bienvenu Tsimbula. And Bienvenu had been heading to a healthcare site to get vaccinated against the virus. He found a group of local protesters there, asking the medical team to leave. They were frustrated by family members whose bodies had been transferred against their will, safe burials that were being imposed by force. The health workers were escorted by Congolese police officers. The locals threw some stones. The police officers responded with live bullets. And Bienvenu, who was a bystander, got shot in the spleen, ended up in hospital, had a surgery, and no longer has a livelihood because his injury has prevented him from farming his fields. So today we have a situation in which more than 2,000 people have died from contracting the virus, but another 11 people, according to the WHO, have died in 390 attacks on healthcare facilities and associated violence. So do you think Bienvenu has trust in the relief effort? For him, it has been compromised by what the UN Human Rights Office has described as disproportionate use of force by police and army when dealing with protests against Ebola responders. And by the way, we also revealed that the World Health Organization's representative in Beni was also advocating for the use of force against the very same people they were meant to be helping. And so it's no surprise that this rush to securitization has undermined the ability to build trust. And one activist who spoke to our journalist said, these youths, their mindset is that these people working for the response are killing us, and so we have to kill them too. And you know that something has gone deeply, deeply wrong in a humanitarian response when you get to the state where recipients of aid feel they are at war with the people providing it. For me, this story of the shooting of Bienvenu, it's a story of decades of mistrust. Mistrust not only by the communities, who are frustrated by years of marginalization and then this sudden interest in Ebola for reasons that they find quite suspicious, but also mistrust of the community by the responders. The story that we all know very well of this neo-colonial approach in which we as aid organizations know better what you need and aren't going to listen to your own ideas about how to respond to this kind of crisis. So they don't trust these communities to make decisions about how to treat their dead or about how to live their lives. And as was the case in the Ebola crisis of 2014 in West Africa, local people were seen as irrational, fearful, violent, and primitive, too ignorant to change. So I don't need to tell you that the result is aid workers being killed, people refusing to get vaccinated, and this deadly virus continuing to spread until this day. The good news is it doesn't have to be this way. And in September, I was at a conference in Washington, and I heard Doctors Without Borders, MSF, describing their approach to dealing with safe burials for Ebola victims. And they would give the family the choice. What would you like to do with the body? And they said that when the families had the choice, 100% of the time, they chose a safe burial. They just wanted the agency to be able to make that decision themselves. Another example of what's possible when trust does exist. These are some Mai rebels, again in Eastern DRC. And earlier this year, we published an article by the Ebola response coordinator in Butembo, who had heard that the body of an 8-month-old boy who died from Ebola was in a village controlled by the Mai. Now, the Mai are self-defense militias who are often feared by local populations because of years of crimes, torture, kidnapping, indiscriminate killings. But the response coordinator knew that the risk of Ebola spreading is most serious immediately after a patient dies, and so he needed to get to that village to vaccinate the people as soon as possible. And this, just to give you some context, even national police and army don't dare to go into some of these areas, and people thought he was crazy. He got to the village, he asked to see the village chief. He found him about to have lunch. The mood was pretty tense, and his hosts kind of remained silent, but invited him to join them for a meal. They were watching him, and only when he started eating with them did the mood kind of lighten. The chief started smiling, they started chatting, and he appreciated the humility that this response coordinator had shown by sitting down for a meal with them. As it turns out, they had never heard of Ebola, nor of vaccination, and he spent 30 minutes describing to them what the virus is, how vaccination works, what preventative measures are. And without saying a word, the village chief got up, assembled the villagers, and called for a list of names of everyone who'd been in contact with this little boy to be handed to the vaccinators. Not a single person in that village developed Ebola virus. So it's very clear the kind of two extremes that we're dealing with here, and that example highlights another point around the whole localization debate. Trust between aid agencies and communities opens up access and ultimately saves lives time and time again when the communities trust the people that are responding. And we've done an entire series on locally led humanitarian response, and we've seen this in the flood response in Malawi, where they were successful in saving more lives because there had been local responders who were well trusted. In the fight to build peace among pastoralist communities jostling over limited resources in Kenya, in the drive for polio vaccinations in ISIS-controlled areas, local aid workers have a huge role to play, and the movement has this amazing asset in the national societies that certainly go a long way in this direction. Now, just as there are very real consequences, for better or for worse, of trust between aid agencies and the communities they serve, so too does this dynamic exist between aid agencies and governments. And states' lack of trust in the systems and policies of aid agencies has led to an increasing number of restrictions linked in particular to counterterrorism operations that are now hampering aid. We've reported on this from Somalia to Nigeria, US policies, and now even the Netherlands, which has a law being debated at the moment which would criminalize travel by Dutch citizens to ISIS-controlled areas without government permission, including aid workers. The result is that many people in areas controlled by so-called terrorists go unassisted. But the consequences, as many of you will know, can be even more direct. And we all remember the attack on the MSF hospital in Kunduz, Afghanistan in 2014. The location of this hospital had been supplied and well communicated to the US military and was nevertheless bombed repeatedly on the argument that Taliban soldiers were inside the hospital. 48 staff and patients died that day, some of them scorched to death in their hospital beds. There were indeed Taliban fighters inside that hospital because, according to international humanitarian law, health workers have an obligation to help combatants who are injured on either side of the conflict. And so Kunduz, for me, is an example of a breakdown in trust of IHL, a breakdown of trust in the idea that humanitarians are just doing their jobs, as mandated by international law, and a breakdown in trust that humanitarians are truly neutral. On the flip side, of course, when humanitarians and those pushing for national security considerations do find the right balance, and where trust exists, the situation looks very different. Think of ICRC delegates getting access to Guantanamo Bay prisoners, of all places. Finally, a word about trust at the system level rather than the operational level. A lack of trust means that big reform packages like the Grand Bargain also begin to become impossible. And we have reported in some depth about this wonderful moment of celebration in 2016 in which many grand pledges were made, descending into a fair bit of haggling over who would do what. No, I'm not going to take action until you show that you're going to take action. And everyone waiting for the other to act because they didn't trust that they would get the good end of the deal. That applies to humanitarians distrusting development actors, which puts the execution of the nexus into question. Distrust of the respective due diligence approaches of different donors, which has made common reporting frameworks very difficult. And then add to that the disincentives in the system for reform, the competition between aid agencies. And 3.5 years after the grand bargain was agreed, progress in making aid more effective has been rather slow. It goes without saying, as George has said, that the lack of public trust in the sector fueled by sex abuse scandals and fraud doesn't make things any better, and in fact puts the entire sector into existential question when that public trust is lost. So, I just want to close by some thoughts on how to deal with this existential problem. Some of the literature around trust gives this definition. Trust is credibility plus reliability plus intimacy divided by self-interest. And so in this equation, credibility is the words you speak. Is what you say credible? Are you a credible source? Reliability is the actions you take. Do you say what you do and do what you say? Intimacy is the degree of safety or security that you feel in entrusting others with sensitive information. And self-orientation or interest is your focus. Are you primarily concerned about yourself or about others? And whose interests come first? So for me, trust is a consequence of good behavior. It is not an ingredient. And while it takes decades to build trust, and while it can vanish overnight, it's not that complicated. So I'm going to give you 4 simple steps that I think you can take as individuals, as organizations, as states, to help build trust. First, don't be a hypocrite. Be clear about your agenda. Don't say you abide by humanitarian principles and then join forces with the military or foreign governments. Don't call out war crimes by one state and not another. Don't say you stand for human rights and then refuse to use the word Rohingya. Don't say you respect the independence of humanitarian action and then prosecute aid workers for doing their job. Second, follow through on your promises. Be honest about what you can and can't do. Don't respond in the crises that are easy and accessible and then abandon the people who need you most in the difficult-to-reach areas. Don't commit to localization and then make excuses for why it's not possible. And certainly, don't come to Geneva, agree resolutions about the respect for IHL, and then go back to war and bomb hospitals.
Too much.
Drink tea.
You have to go to the drafting committee.
I'm going to get kicked off the stage very soon. What do I mean by that? I mean, get to know the communities that you are serving. Drink tea with them. Get to know their culture. Speak their language. This is simple stuff, and yet it doesn't happen. Practice humility. The future of international solidarity is going to be local. We all know that. And so we need to start as an international community supporting local people in the way they see best. Finally, check yourself. Trust is not a hotline. It's about corruption. It's about political influence. It's about paternalism. It's about hypocrisy. And if you want to reduce your self-interest, you need to put a check on those very human and organizational tendencies. Trust cannot be a mushy second best to accountability. It's not good enough to just say, trust us. Put in place checks and balances that are visibly functioning and that give people a reason to trust you. The movement is taking steps in that direction, but I think you can go further. A few humble suggestions. What about addressing the rivalries between the ICRC and the IFRC? What about encouraging media like ours to hold you accountable? What about free elections for the head of national societies? What about a freedom of information rule?
Yes.
What about having representatives of your beneficiaries on your board? What I'm saying is you cannot fix trust, you have to change behavior. And so, if trust is credibility plus reliability plus intimacy divided by self-interest, build your credibility by not being hypocrites. Build your reliability by following through on your promises. Increase your intimacy by drinking tea with the people you serve, and reduce your self-interest by putting in place systems that check your power. Trust is not an auxiliary, it is core to your mission, and it's really time you started treating it as such. This will require courage, and it will require leadership, and appealing to the better nature of your angels in very difficult situations. Are you brave enough? Thank you.
Thank you. so much.